This episode of Gather and Go is sponsored by Coastal Mississippi. Play Coastal Mississippi. 62 miles of shoreline, outdoor adventures, casinos, fishing, and fantastic food. Perfect for fun-filled itineraries. Visit coastalmississippi.com and go have some fun for fun's sake. Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to Gather and Go, the podcast that helps you plan, promote, and lead better trips. I'm Brian Jewell. I am your host, and I am especially glad that you decided to spend some of your time with us today. And as always, our promise to you is that we're going to do everything we can to make that investment of your time worth your while. Now, today I have an awesome conversation for you that I am so excited to bring you. We're going to talk to Paige McClanahan, who is an award-winning travel journalist and author of the new book, The New Tourist. We're going to talk all about the past and future of travel and how we can all play a role in making sure that future is bright for everyone involved. Now, in this featured conversation, you're going to hear us discuss how destinations around the world are dealing with growing visitation. We're going to talk about how you can help your travelers make peace with the idea of being tourists. And we're going to discuss the role travel professionals play in making the travel industry more meaningful and more sustainable. This is a super enlightening conversation. You will not want to miss it. First, though, let's start with some travel news you may have missed. Alaska's capital city has rejected a proposed restriction on cruise ship arrivals. Residents of Juneau, Alaska voted down a ballot measure that would have banned cruise ships from calling on the city on Saturdays, as well as the 4th of July. The measure was proposed by Juneau locals concerned about the number of tourists who arrive by cruise ships, saying the local government is not doing enough to manage the influx of cruise visitors. Officials say the city of 32,000 received 1.65 million visitors last year. Some days, more than 20,000 cruise passengers arrive in the small city. Although the proposal collected enough signatures to appear as a ballot initiative in the city's early October election, the measure was supported by only about 40% of voters, falling far short of the majority required to pass. The measure was opposed by a coalition of businesses around Juneau, as well as tourism organizations from outside the state, who said restricting cruise ship visitation would be an unfair blow to the city's economy. The vote came as some cruise lines reported higher than ever demand for Alaska cruises. Carnival Corporation recently told investors on an earnings call that Alaska was, quote, off the charts this year, especially for first-time cruisers. Well, now it's time for the road tip segment of our show. This is the part of every episode where we dig deep into our bag of travel knowledge from decades on the road and bring you tips to make your next trip less stressful and more successful. Well, a few years ago, I was assisting a DMO client in facilitating a FAM tour for some tour operators and group travel leaders, and I committed the cardinal sin of leading a group trip. That's right. I accidentally left a member of our group behind. We were at an attraction and people had some free time, and everybody got on the bus at the agreed upon time, and I did a quick head count. And we took off for our next spot. I didn't realize that I had counted wrong until we were several blocks away. And I got a phone call from this very kind and gracious lady saying, hey, I think I just saw the bus leave. Now, fortunately, one of my colleagues was able to swing by and pick her up in a separate car and meet us at the next attraction. And it was kind of no big deal. But it got me to thinking, what would I have done if I had been leading that group alone? How would I have handled getting that lady to the place she was supposed to be? How would I have handled letting her know where to meet us? It could have been a pretty bad situation. And as I thought about that, I realized that perhaps the best tool that a group travel leader has in a situation like that, if you can't turn the bus around and pick someone up, is the location sharing feature on your smartphone. That's right. You may not realize it, but the same GPS tools on your phone that allow you to map your route through new cities and follow driving directions to different destinations also allows you to pinpoint exactly where you are pretty much anywhere on Earth and share that location with anybody you want. There's a variety of ways you can share that location. You can send it in a text message. Most group messaging apps like WhatsApp or GroupMe or Signal also allow you to send your location. This is a really powerful tool. Let me give you an example of some times when you might want to share your location with your travelers on a group trip. If the initial meeting point for the group is someplace that most everyone hasn't been before, say they all flew in separately or something like that, sharing your location with the group is a good way to make sure everyone is clear on exactly where to go so that nobody accidentally plugs the wrong coordinates into their rideshare app. No one is at the wrong hotel, the wrong pickup spot. They know exactly where you are, and they have an easy time finding you. Another great time to share your location is when you are regrouping after giving people free time on the trip. If you have free time in a city that has many options for people, you might find that your group scatters in many different directions. And most people in your group are not going to have any trouble finding their way back to you at the end of a couple hours of free time. However, there are probably one or two that might struggle with it. They might take a wrong turn. They may have wandered too far afield. They may just not be good with directions. Well, this is a great time to drop the location of the meeting point in the group chat so that anyone who is unsure of how to make their way back to where you are can find you without much stress. Another great time that is related to this would be if your drop-off and pickup spots are in different places. Occasionally, you will tour a site, especially in a big city where a motor coach may not be able to idle to drop people off or pick them up, or there may not be motor coach parking. You may have to board the bus in a different place than where you got off. If that's more than, say, a block away or so, drop the location of the pickup point in your group chat or however you're communicating with people during the trip so that everyone knows exactly how to find the bus. And finally, when somebody is lost, this is an invaluable time to share that location. If the tour I was on, if we hadn't had someone with a car who was able to swing by and pick up the passenger that I left behind, what I probably would have done was simply send her the location of the place we were headed next and maybe order her an Uber or something like that. Of course, at my expense, I wouldn't ask her to pick up that expense. And let her know exactly where to meet us. Or if I wasn't sure where the person was, I might do the opposite of that. I might call or text the person and say, hey, can you let us know where you are? And if that person is lost, then I would work with them and walk them through the steps of sharing their location with me so that I and the driver and whoever else was involved in that trip would know exactly where to find them. Now, not only can you share your own location, but you can share the locations of other places as well, including restaurants, landmarks, even pins that you can drop in a map to mark a specific site, something as general as a street corner that doesn't have any particular landmark, but is going to be a convenient meeting place or otherwise important for your group. So I would recommend if you are giving your people some free time in a city and giving them recommendations about restaurants or attractions to visit, I would get in the group chat and share the locations of those restaurants or attractions, either as a dropped pin or as a site that is already marked on the map. Put that in the group chat so nobody has to come to you afterwards and say, hey, can you give me directions to that pizza place you mentioned? Or could you help me find this museum? I'm having trouble getting there on my own. Put it in the group chat so everyone has it at their fingertips. They can navigate to it easily on their own. So if you don't have location services turned on your phone, when you hit the road with a group is a great time to make sure you turn them on and you know how to use them so that you can take advantage of this super helpful and perhaps even really important tool the next time you have a group on the road. And that is your road tip of the week. Now, before we move on, I want to take just a minute and share a little bit of news from us. And this is news particularly for any of you who are listening to Gather and Go for the first time, or maybe you're a new listener to the show. I want to let you know we have a library of more than 60 episodes stretching back over 2 years. And I would love for you to take advantage of all the resources and hints and fantastic conversations throughout the history of our show. When you go back and listen to some past episodes, you'll hear things like conversations with tourism thought leaders such as Bruce Poontip of G Adventures. We've got nuts and bolts tips from experts such as travel photographer Stephanie Miller. You'll hear interviews with luminaries like TV travel personality Andrew Zimmern. We've got first-person travel success stories with tour operators like Stacey Berry, and many, many more cool conversations. Plus lots of travel news, road tips, and of course, some hot minute rants from me. Now, you can find all of our past episodes, all 60 of them, wherever you listen to podcasts. Simply search for Gather and Go in your favorite podcast player. Hit that subscribe or follow button while you're there. Or if you prefer, you can find every single one of them on our website at grouptravelleader.com/podcast. Well, it's just about time for us to get into our featured conversation with Paige McClanahan. As we do, let me remind you, you can find a wrap-up of some of the most important things Paige and I talked about in the show notes for this episode. Show notes are simply the text that displays below the audio player wherever you listen to Gather and Go. Also in the show notes, you're going to find some important links and lots of other helpful resources, so be sure you check that out. And hey, after the interview, I'm going to do a quick wrap-up of some of those most important ideas as well, just to make sure you don't miss them. And then at the end of that wrap-up, I want to come back to this issue of popular destinations putting restrictions on tourism and discuss whether or not that is a good or fair idea. That's going to be the topic of today's Hot Minute. You won't want to miss that. We'll be right back with Paige McClanahan.
Let's go, my kiddos! Rise and shine! I am tired of early morning alarms and sitting in carpool lines. I want to relax with a spa day. No more family meetings. I want a family outing. Booked a big one there. My to-do list has taken over. How about a to-dream list instead? First up, play Coastal and go have some fun for fun's sake.
Make a vacation declaration of your own and start planning your escape to the Mississippi Gulf Coast at coastalmississippi.com.
All right, everybody. My guest today is an American journalist based in France whose work has appeared in outlets such as The New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, and The Washington Post. For the past 5 years, she has covered the tourism industry, winning recognition from the Society of American Travel Writers and the North American Travel Journalists Association. And she's the author of the fascinating new book called The New Tourist: Waking Up to the Power and Perils of Travel. Paige McClanahan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
I am so excited to have you. I picked up your book earlier this summer when it came out, and I think I was 2 or 3 chapters in when I reached out to you and said, would you please come on our podcast? So delighted to have you here today. We want to talk about the book, but before we get there, tell our audience how you found yourself, number one, as an American living abroad, and number two, as a journalist covering the travel industry.
Well, thank you, Brian. And yeah, well, first of all, there's some long answers to those questions, but I'll give you the brief sort of rundown. So yeah, I'm American. I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, but I moved abroad in 2008 and have lived overseas ever since. And I first moved to Geneva, Switzerland, and I had a job there as an editor. I was writing news at a think tank in Geneva. But from there, I moved from Switzerland to West Africa. I was in Sierra Leone for 2 years. And that's where I got into freelancing, writing for the Christian Science Monitor and then the Guardian. And I got my first travel writing gig there. I prepared the second edition of the Brat Guide to Sierra Leone, which was pretty cool. And then I did 2 years in England, where I was writing more for the Guardian. And then 4 years in Nairobi, where I was doing comms for the UN Environment Program, and some other people too. And then in 2018, moved with my family to a little village in the French Alps, as I recount in the introduction to the book. And this is because when we were living in Geneva, Ollie, who was my boyfriend at the time, we went up a lot to, over the weekends, we would go up into the mountains to sort of go hiking or mountain biking or skiing. And we fell in love with this little village, as I described at the beginning of the book. And after lots of moving around, we decided actually this is where we want to settle. And so we moved there with our daughters, who were 2 and 4 at the time, into this little village. And I was working as a freelance journalist, and he, was running his own consulting business. And that was home for 5 years. And it was really there. I had worked as a journalist. I'd written about all sorts of different topics. And travel writing had been part of my kind of journalistic portfolio, but it wasn't really, I'd say, the focus. But then moving to this little village and seeing how tourism animated this village was really, really kind of piqued my interest and showed me that, actually there's a lot more depth and nuance to this thing called tourism than I had really appreciated before. And I had a good thing going with my editor at the New York Times, and was writing for the travel section of the New York Times. And then, of course, when COVID hit, travel writing, travel journalism went through a big shift, just like everyone in the world of travel and everyone in the world in general. And so my journalism shifted with that to reporting more on, and I had been doing a bit of this before, but really focusing on reporting on travel and tourism and bringing the sort of economic and political lens that I had used in other parts of my journalistic sort of career to this massive phenomenon of tourism. And so, yeah, it was really through my reporting for the New York Times that the idea for the book kind of, that I generated the idea for the book, because I just wanted to go more in depth. And I really wanted to bring to life some of the people who I was lucky enough to be able to meet in my reporting work. And yeah, you just can't do that in a 1,500 word news article, really. So I got the idea for a book, and yeah, here we are.
Do you remember the moment or the assignment you were working on or the place you were visiting when you realized there's a story I want to tell here, there's something I want to investigate here, and it's probably a book and not another news article?
Yeah, interesting. Any particular moment? I mean, I'm thinking of, it was really, in a lot of ways, the book is kind of an expression of the manifestation of me trying to work through some of my own complicated thoughts and feelings about being, a tourist and also being a travel writer, a travel journalist. And there was one article that I wrote. So when at first for the New York Times, I was doing a lot of 36 hours stories. So I did a story, 36 hours in Zurich. And that ran, it was published, I want to say it was early March 2020. It was one of the last 36 hours stories that they ran before they shut down like that section, that kind of aspect of their travel coverage, the New York Times. And I remember feeling a little uncomfortable with that story, just nothing to do with my editors, but just for me, for a few different reasons. One, because I lived in an alpine village and I knew that I would never do a 36-hour story about the village where I lived because oh my gosh, I wouldn't be able to look my fellow parents in the eyes at school drop-off. They would but I was okay to drive a couple of hours and write it about this other village, And then also it went up at this moment, with COVID running sort of wild and reading the comments of that, there were a lot of comments being like, what are you doing publishing a story like this in a pandemic? And other people like, what are you doing publishing an article telling people to go across the world for literally a day and a half when the climate is in crisis? And then knowing that and then feeling like I wrote about this other alpine village that I wouldn't, in a way that I wouldn't want anyone to come and write about my alpine village, encouraging a global audience of however many millions to come for a day and a half. So I really felt that tension when that article was published. And I was like, what am I doing? But travel is important, but tourism is important. But how am I I don't get it. What do I do with this difficult feeling?
Yeah.
And that was really, and then we went into lockdown and I had some time to chew on it, but I would say that not necessarily writing and reporting that story, but the reaction that I saw in myself was there's a lot in here that I need to pick apart. So maybe that's one moment that really was a source of inspiration, maybe.
Yeah. I love that sort of, I don't want to call it dualistic, but a very balanced and holistic view of yourself and of the industry of saying this is important. There are problems in it. It affects some people's lives negatively, some people's lives positively. Let's dive in. Let's talk about it. So the book does a beautiful job of that. One of the things I really appreciated starting toward the very beginning was you kind of charting the history of the modern tourism industry. And I'll be fully transparent. I'm in my early 40s and I had never stopped to think about how did we get here? Because my whole life, tourism's been available. I had not had the curiosity to realize it hasn't always been that way. And in fact, it's a fairly recent phenomenon, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, we're the same age. I'm 42. And so, yeah, we've experienced this in a similar way, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy to forget just how dramatic this change has been, over the space of a couple of generations. I mean, we've gone from, I think in 1950, oh gosh, the figures are like maybe 25 million, if I remember that off the top of my head, international tourist arrivals to 1.5 billion in 2024, which is what we're expecting to see. It's huge. And it's, when you think about the impacts on like the human race, like, oh my gosh, like we are encountering people from other backgrounds, other nationalities, other, cultures and languages and religions, in a way that we have never before experienced in humanity, right? Like this is really important. And so at the beginning of the book, I wanted to help the reader just sort of arrive at the present moment with me. And I thought, okay, how do I tell the story of the last, say, 50 years of, tourism? And I thought, okay, well, I need, as a writer, I think I need a main character or two, and I need a narrative arc, and I need a sort of a storyline for my reader to follow. And so I thought, what better way to do this than to kind of tell it through the eyes or through the experience of Tony and Maureen Wheeler, the co-founders of Lonely Planet. And as, somebody, I was born in 1982 and traveling in the late 90s, early 2000s. Of course, I had my like Lonely Planet, guidebook, and along with like Let's Go and, rough guides and stuff. And I was fascinated by that history. And I thought somebody must have told the story of like the explosion of the travel guidebook and the rise of like backpacker travel. And I couldn't, find somebody who'd written it for, a non-academic audience in a way that I thought was really, as thorough as something that I wanted to read. So I thought, okay, well, maybe that's my story to tell at the beginning of the book. And it was so much fun doing the research, and I got to have cool conversations with all sorts of fun people. So I really enjoyed writing that chapter.
Yeah, I love the read, and it made me realize how much of what I experience when I travel is sort of a not too distant descendant of what, a couple of crazy 20-somethings figured out how to do with, a half broke down van driving through Southeast Asia or whatever, right? I mean, they charted this idea of travel that has kind of become this ideal that so many of us chase, whether successfully or not. So it gave me a huge appreciation for where that attitude comes from. Another thing you did really well is kind of paint a picture of what the life cycle of a tourism destination looks like, or some of the stages a destination goes through, from being purely undiscovered all the way to maybe, but hopefully not, completely overrun by tourism. Give us a brief version of what that looks like for a lot of destinations.
You're talking about Butler's tourism area life cycle, which was, first put forward I think in the 1980s, if I remember off the top of my head. And it's this idea that there's a kind of a typical life cycle of going from the kind of undiscovered phase to the early development stage to something being kind of fully established to becoming sort of like overripe, shall we say. And then, either the place kind of becomes unfashionable and kind of falls out of favor, or it like pivots hard and becomes, kind of reinvents itself in another way. And I think, in this, a lot of other academics have kind of come forward since and proposed different sort of approaches to this or critiqued it, or so it's not like fully set in stone. But, I think in the book, I really wanted to take a look at tourism destinations that are in different points of this cycle. And I wanted to question the inevitability of one, passage from one stage into the other. And is it inevitable that once you hit a sort of certain level of maturity, that things are going to turn, kind of turn bad, as it were? And I think it's kind of implicit in this model that this is, if tourism continues to grow, then at some point it is going to turn bad. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think that local governments especially have a huge amount of, power over whether tourism continues to develop in a way that is in line with, a sustainable quality of life of its residents or not. And I thought it was I was kind of worried in writing out that section, like, am I going to get too policy wonky for my reader here? Don't want to give them like a little lecture on tourism management. But I thought it was a helpful framework for thinking about, putting all of this into perspective. So I wanted to make sure to include that too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You give a couple of examples of different cities in the world that are at different points on that life cycle, and maybe locals having very different points of view about what tourism means to them. So I think of the section on Liverpool where you're talking to locals who are saying we love this, and then sections maybe on some of the more popular destinations in Europe where people are kind of rolling their eyes. And of course, we saw the protests this summer and stuff. Dive into that a little bit. What does a success story in 2024 look like in Liverpool or another city you covered? And then what are some of the real struggles, maybe even if they're not the water guns squirting at tourists that are grabbing headlines? What give us the good and the bad you're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and just thank you for that question, because I think it's really important to talk about the good and the bad examples. And of course, as a journalist, I appreciate that, a protester squirting water gun at a tourist makes a good headline, and that's going to be news, right? And that, especially if there are TV crews there or people with their phones out capturing this, that's going to be a news story. Liverpool as a successful tourism destination where this is sort of reviving the economy, that's not going to make a headline really, or it might, but like it's not very clickable. It's not going to be at the top of the page, So it's important, I think, to keep in mind that there are so many good news stories about tourism that are not making the headlines. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, really. But yeah, Liverpool, I mean, it was this, had it in its heyday, it was in the 19th century as like this big sort of port city and, the British Empire. And but then the port started to decline and the city declined with it. And by the 1980s, it was, one of the, in the early 90s, it was one of the poorest urban areas in Europe. In the 1980s, there were riots. It was known as Smack City because it had a huge heroin problem. But local authorities really turned to tourism very explicitly to try to revive the city's economy. And they built the Tate Liverpool Museum, which opened in 1988, right on the city's waterfront. And then, invested in renovating the city's sort of harbor and made a big pedestrianized urban shopping zone. And they got the European Capital of Culture, and they got listed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And through all of this, it attracted more investment, it attracted more attention, and they hosted Eurovision sort of song contest in 2023. And so they've really been able to use in Liverpool, tourism to create a new industry in the city where the traditional kind of shipping industry had really declined. And they were able to use that to generate income, generate jobs for the residents in a way that, from my perspective, and from the people I spoke to, everyone seemed really excited about and really, more than happy with. They were thrilled with this and the fact that tourism had given this city a new lease on life, really. But then you could say is Liverpool, just kind of Liverpool maybe will be 30 or 40 years from now. Will be the same headlines we're seeing in Barcelona, we'll be seeing in Liverpool, right? Is that possible? Absolutely. Is that a given? Absolutely not. So I think, interesting to capture Liverpool at that moment and see the positive impacts there. But one example of a place where I saw more negative resident sentiment toward tourism was Hawaii. And this is a place where, tourism disappeared completely during the pandemic. And from what I was hearing when I was there and from what the surveys were showing is that a lot of Hawaiians, instead of kind of missing the tourists and all the revenue that they were bringing, was that actually during the pandemic, Hawaiians, a lot of people who were resident in Hawaii realized just how much they had been giving up to tourists for so long, and that actually they didn't want to return to the old way of doing things. But at the same time, there are really deep interests. There are people with a lot of economic interest in maintaining tourism, in keeping tourist numbers high in Hawaii. And so I thought it's a really interesting tension, and I don't have the answers as a travel journalist who's visiting and doing my best to learn from people. Yeah, let me introduce my reader to some really important voices that I hear in this space, and some voices that they might not encounter otherwise. So Kuike, this man who I was privileged enough to spend time with, who is very anti-tourism. John DeFries, a native Hawaiian who is the head, or who was at the time the head of the Hawaii Tourism Authority. And then Cindy Punahaole, who is another native Hawaiian voice that I include in the story, who I write about in the epilogue, who is really working, on the front line, shall we say, of tourism and finding a way to constructively harness the power of tourism in service of her community and the natural landscape in Hawaii. So, but yeah, it's, Hawaii is, it's a long and complicated history of tourism in Hawaii, but a place where I think residents are increasingly getting involved in how tourism is being managed. And so I think it's an important story there too.
Yeah, absolutely. It struck me reading the book that I was certainly seeing some perspectives I agreed with and some I disagreed with. I think anybody who reads is going to see something they don't totally agree with, but it's definitely going to give them some things to think about. So I really appreciated that. I also appreciated you're pretty clear-eyed about who we are as travelers today. I think of the long-running meme, for lack of a better word, of people saying, "Oh, I'm not a tourist. I'm a traveler." And I understand that sentiment. You kind of deal with that and kind of say, "Hey, look, guys, come on. Let's be honest. We're all a little bit of both, right?" Like, give us some of your thinking behind that.
Yeah, I mean, and just to say, like, I totally, I've been there. I'm somebody who likes to think of myself as, I travel for kind of high-minded reasons, and I want to go and have real experiences and not do kind of cheap tourist stuff. So I totally empathize with kind of not wanting to associate oneself with the word tourist. However, I think, and in doing the research for this book, I just really appreciated the profound power of tourism, and I thought, if all of us think of tourism as something that other people do, or as tourists as other people and not as me, then we kind of take away a lot of our power. Like, I think, this stigma that I would love for the book, or, to help shake loose some of the stigma around the word tourist or tourism, mainly because I don't think it's really helpful. I think if we sort of own our identity as tourists, then, we can sort of give ourselves back the power to actually transform this massive thing that we're all part of. And we don't see the headlines about, like, oh, mass tourism causing problems, and think, oh, well, that's other people who are doing that. That's not me. It's like, okay, yeah, I mean, maybe you didn't go to the city that's being mentioned in that headline, but you're a tourist too. Like, this is something that you're implicated in. And so, I think it's remembering that we're tourists is just an important sort of step that we can take to owning all of the good and all of the bad that comes with tourism. And I hope it might serve as an inspiration for all of us to do our best to raise our expectations for what tourism is and what tourism can bring to the world.
Yeah, and that's sort of your vision of what the new tourist can be. So can you kind of give us that in a nutshell? If you could shape the traveler of, let's say, 2030, what is that person doing? What are their motivations behind travel? And how are they different than, maybe what you and I have experienced for the last 20 years of our adult lives?
I think, like the kind of spectrum between what I call in the book an old tourist and a new tourist, it's like a sliding scale, and we're all somewhere in the middle, and we all kind of slide up and down depending on the day or the week of the month or whatever. So I see it as a kind of a progression that we can all continually strive toward. But yeah, I see, like, on one end, the old tourist, this is someone who I think of as a pure consumer who is coming to tick a box. They're traveling to, like, get the shot for Instagram, to be able to brag to their friends, to just, they're not traveling for reasons that are really kind of coming from somewhere deep inside them, shall we say. It's more kind of ego-based. And they see the place is there to serve them. Like, they have their money, like, I'm here to get my money's worth. I'm a consumer here to consume. And the product is the destination and the people who live in it who are here to give me what I'm coming to buy. So this is kind of the old, either what I call the old tourist sort of approach. Whereas the new tourist is somebody who travels with a huge amount of humility and curiosity, who does not think that they are better than the people or the place that they're coming to visit, who realizes deep down that this place that they're visiting owes them nothing, right? That they are a guest in, other people's homes when they travel. And, their duty is to travel with, humility and curiosity, and with a view to making real human connections with the people in the place they're visiting. And the new tourist is also somebody who really takes the time to educate themselves before they visit a place so they can understand the challenges that the place is experiencing, whether with tourism or otherwise. But then they can use that information to inform their decision making so that during their visit, they can make sure to make decisions that will minimize any negative impact of their visit and maximize the positive impact of their time in the place, whether that's through, how they're spending their money or, kind of social, cultural connections that they're making with locals. The new tourist is somebody who really appreciates the power of tourism and kind of steps into that with a really optimistic and constructive mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. It occurs to me that tourism is not a one-sided activity, though. We didn't become those old tourists on our own. There was an interaction between the destinations and the destination marketers and all the vendors we worked with. And so I wonder if you have some thoughts about the role that the professional travel industry has to play. Our listeners, our tour operators, our travel agents, what role do they have to play in sort of reshaping tourism into this more positive force?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think that tourism operators are really in a powerful position to shape the sort of the views and perspectives and attitudes of so many people. So it's a really, I'm excited to have the chance to speak to this audience. I mean, I think that one kind of concrete thing that tour operators can do is to encourage their travelers to travel with an open mind and with a view to having their perspective shifted on a place. And of course, that means, like if you're coming to, my home city now of Paris, for instance, of course, people are going to want to do some of the classic sites, and that's wonderful. And you should go do the classic sites and go, like I would say, encourage your visitors to go do things that might challenge them, that might put them outside of their comfort zones, or that might challenge at least their expectations of what Paris is and what one does in the French capital. So I'm thinking specifically of I love to recommend that people visit the Grande Mosquée de Paris, the Great Mosque of Paris, which is in a beautiful location in the city, and it has 100-year history. And you can go there and you can learn so much about the Arab and Muslim heritage in the city, which is really huge and a really big part of French history. You can go on a walking tour with Paris Noir, like a walking tour that offers, history lessons on the Black, influence in history here in Paris. So, I would encourage tour operators to encourage their travelers or give their travelers opportunities to experience other narratives or stories about the places that they're visiting that might not necessarily align with their expectations, but that at the same time are also going to be fun and interesting and fun and interesting for the travelers.
Yeah. Does that require slowing down and spending more time, or is there a way to still diversify your Paris experience if you're only going to sleep there 3 nights before you move on to the next European capital?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes and yes. I mean, I think, another thing that I'd like to recommend to people who, if someone's coming to me for sort of specific advice, is I do say, travel more slowly, travel, maybe have fewer trips, but stay longer in a place. And this is going to allow you to, develop a richer kind of connection with the place and, maybe sort of meet people, in the sort of who are like running businesses in the area where you're staying, or just kind of get to know the city in some more depth. It's also going to give you the chance to contribute to the local economy in a more meaningful way. But, I appreciate, as, Americans, we don't have that much vacation time, and Europe is this vast continent and we want to see as much of it as possible. So if you have 3 days for Paris, wonderful, come to Paris for 3 days, make sure you see the sites that you really want to see, and also include, at least a few things in there that are not your kind of typical top 5 what to do in Paris. Include a few things that are going to surprise you or going to kind of take you outside your comfort zone or challenge your expectations in some way. So I think, if you can stay longer, do. If not, there are other ways that you can find to kind of lean into this new tourist approach.
So what is the best way for people to find you, follow you, and, get to know more about what you're doing?
Oh, thank you so much for that question, Brian. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. I'm at Paige McClanahan. Apologize, my last name is a little bit long, but it's very phonetic. You can also go to my website, PaigeMcClanahan.com, and sign up for my newsletter. I send a newsletter once a month, talking about kind of what I've been up to, and also sharing some links and, some like fun links and things about things that I'm coming across in the world of travel and tourism that I think are worth following, worth reading.
Absolutely. We will link to all those in the show notes. Before we let you go, we have some questions we ask every guest, and these are just for fun.
Okay.
So no pressure. You can just answer off the top of your head. For starters, when you book travel, are you booking a window seat or an aisle seat?
Window seat.
Yeah. Just for the view?
Yeah, the view, man. I love the view. It's great. And then also if I want to have a nap, I have a little like built-in rest for my head against the wall.
Yeah. Makes sense. So what's something in your carry-on that you wouldn't travel without?
Oh my gosh. Something in my carry-on that I wouldn't travel without. I mean, I got to say my headphones. I love podcasts. I love music. I love audiobooks. I'm a total audiobook nerd. I was so thrilled to have the chance to record the narration for this audiobook.
Oh yeah.
That was super cool. So yeah, I'm always listening to something, and that's how I consume most, like the majority of the books I've read, I'm just saying in air quotes, over the last 5 years have been audiobooks. I really love audiobooks. So
yeah,
headphones.
Yeah, makes sense. If you had a free airline pass, or we can say train pass, or steamer ship pass, whatever kind of transportation you'd like, if you had a free pass and a week with nothing else to do, where would you head next?
Oh man, I gotta say, I would head to San Francisco. It's a beautiful city, but also my dearest friend from childhood lives in San Francisco, and some other dear friends, and a cousin who I'm close to and his family. So San Francisco, beautiful, fascinating city, so much to do, and so many people I miss really dearly live in San Francisco. So I would go to San Francisco. Yeah.
Oh, that's sweet. So last question: what's something you have seen or done on the road that you wish you could go back and do again with somebody you love?
Oh, wow. I would have to say Kerala, India, which is on the southern coast of India. And it's this beautiful, kind of tropical environment with beautiful sort of white sand beaches and lagoons. And I was there for the book. I write about how, village tourism is happening in a really responsible and constructive way in Kerala. And the whole time I was there, I kept thinking, oh my gosh, my mom, both of my parents, but really my mom, would just love this. And the interaction with the people who are living in the village. And that this is being, it's being done in a way that where the villagers have really, they've shaped the terms and conditions. That you're visiting and you're contributing to their incomes. It was just a really wonderful experience. And I thought, oh my God, my mom would just love it here. So I would love to go back to Kerala with my parents.
Ah, beautiful. Hope you can make that happen someday. The book is The New Tourist: Waking Up to the Power and Perils of Travel. Paige McClanahan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brian. It was fun.
All right, everybody, I want to take a minute to tell you about Malta. This archipelago in the Mediterranean is a living museum of the 2,000-year history of Christianity. When the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked there in AD 60, the islanders were impressed by his delivery of the gospel and the miracles he performed, and were baptized as Christians. This heritage places these islands among the most important archaeological centers of the ancient Christian world. Now, you can see some of this history in the unique Christian catacombs, a hallmark of prevailing customs during the early Christian era that make the Maltese religious heritage unique. And many Malta residents are deeply devoted to the Virgin Mary. Luke was shipwrecked in Malta with Paul, and his gospel account is full of details of Mary's life. Historic artifacts and oral traditions demonstrate that the Maltese have remained Marian devotees ever since. Plan your trip to Malta to explore more history. For more information, go to visitmalta.com. Well, I sure hope you enjoyed that conversation with Paige McClanahan. And hey, listen, I really can't say enough how excellent her book, The New Tourist, is. If you are a reader or simply someone who is interested in the future of the travel industry, this is one you need to have on your list for sure. Now, I want to hit a couple of the things that Paige said one more time just to make sure you don't miss them, because I think they are really important and could be really helpful to all of us. Now, when we were discussing the concept of the word tourist and whether there's a difference between a tourist and a traveler, Paige said, I don't think the stigma around the word tourist is really helpful. I think if we own our identity as tourists, we can sort of give ourselves back the power to actually transform this massive thing we're all part of. And we don't see headlines about over-tourism and think, oh, that's other people, that's not me. She said, remembering that we're tourists is an important step we can take to owning all of the good and all of the bad that comes with tourism. And I hope it might serve as an inspiration. You know, I am really grateful to Paige for putting this in such plain language. For years, many people, probably including myself, have been shy about the word tourist and wanted to fashion ourselves as travelers who somehow rise above the industry and the commercialism of it all. But the fact is, when you travel, you are relying on infrastructure and commerce that has been constructed for other travelers. You are a tourist as much as anyone else is a tourist. And being honest about that concept opens the doors for some really valuable reflection and insight and conversation about what we are all doing together as tourists and how we might be able to all do it better. Now, when we went on to talk about the difference between the old tourist and the new tourist, Paige said the old tourist is a pure consumer who is coming to tick a box. They're traveling to get the shot for Instagram, to be able to brag to their friends. The reasons aren't coming from deep inside them. It's ego-based, and they see the place as there to serve them. She said the new tourist is somebody who travels with a huge amount of humility and curiosity. They don't think they're better than the people or the place they're coming to visit. They realize the place owes them nothing, that they're a guest in other people's homes, and their duty is to travel with a view to making real human connections. She said the new tourist is somebody who appreciates the power of tourism and kind of steps into that with a really optimistic and constructive mindset. Boy, I think this is so powerful. What a great way of thinking about the world. I remember growing up, and when I first started traveling, the people who were taking me abroad would warn me about the stereotype of the ugly American and how not to be an ugly American when I traveled internationally. Those lessons really hit close to home. And I think what Paige is saying here is really a kind of similar thing. That old tourist, that ugly American, goes out looking for ways to make a destination serve them. But an insightful traveler, the new tourist, somebody who cares about people and places when they visit, is hitting the road with curiosity and humility. They're there to learn. They're there to have their eyes opened. They're going to enjoy themselves, certainly, but they are not there to be simply consumers. Those are the kinds of travelers that reflect well on the US or wherever they're coming from. They reflect well on the organizations they're traveling with. Those are the kind of people that turn travel into an enormous force for good. Now, when we talked about the role of travel professionals in sort of charting a course toward a better tourism economy, Paige said, one concrete thing tour operators can do is encourage their travelers to travel with an open mind and a view to having their perspectives shifted on a place. She said you should give your travelers opportunities to experience other narratives or stories about the places they're visiting that may not necessarily align with their expectations. I love this perspective because no place in the world is as simple as it may seem from the outside. There's no issue that is simply two-sided. There is no problem that is intractable. There is no people group that can be reduced to a certain set of customs or clothing or cultures or anything like that. And when we are reductive in travel, when we give little snapshots or glamorized versions of places we visit or only tell part of the story, we're really doing our travelers a disservice, and we're doing the places we visit a disservice too. So I love this idea of saying, hey, while we're here, we're going to have some fun, but we're also going to come at it with an open mind. We're going to hear some stories and some perspectives that you may not hear very often, and we're going to challenge the way we think about this place. And at the end of that process, you may not change the way people think about the world. You certainly aren't going to change the way they vote, but you probably are going to make them a more empathetic and understanding traveler and a better citizen of the world. And that is, after all, what travel is all about. Great stuff there from Paige McClanahan. Well, we talked earlier in the program about Juneau, Alaska, and the efforts that ultimately failed there to put some legal restrictions on when cruise ships can call on the popular city. And it got me to thinking about the role that local government plays, or should not play, in restricting visitation. And that's going to be the topic of today's Hot Minute. Yeah, that's right. The Hot Minute is the portion of the program where I take 60 seconds to give you my unfiltered views on an issue that impacts tourism every day. And today we're going to ask the question, should popular destinations put restrictions on tourism? So let's put 60 seconds on the clock and get into it. I'm sympathetic to destinations struggling with over-tourism, but to some extent, they are victims of their own success. Many of them have spent decades marketing themselves to travelers, and I'm not okay with them changing attitudes now and slamming the door in the faces of people who want to visit. Now, foreign countries can do whatever they want, but in the United States, we enjoy freedom of movement. That means any American has the right to travel to any other American destination, even if that city is struggling with over-tourism. In Juneau or other places, restricting cruise ship arrivals is an unfair infringement on that right. And there are other better solutions, such as raising port fees or implementing tourism taxes, that can help soften demand without restricting supply. Outright bans on visitation are inherently unfair, both to visitors and the locals who depend on them. Well, that's the Hot Minute. That's how I see things anyway. Of course, as always, you are welcome to disagree with me, and we can still be friends. And hey, whether you agree, disagree, have other thoughts, we would love to hear from you. You can email podcast@grouptravelleader.com. I read every message that comes into that account. I love hearing from you. Send me your thoughts, questions, complaints, rebuttals, anything you have to say. And you never know, your ideas might just be the topic of the next Hot Minute. And hey, while you're in the mood to give us some feedback, would you do me a big favor? Would you go to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to the show, and give us a rating, leave us a review? Those are really helpful. And I am so thankful to everyone who has done that so far. My thanks as well to Paige McClanahan for joining us. On the next episode of Gather and Go, I'm going to bring you a very helpful conversation with Sheila Folk, who is the founder of Travel Industry Solutions. We're going to talk about all the legal threats and hassles that are out there for travel sellers and how you can take steps to protect yourself and your organization from some nightmare scenarios that could cause real headaches. That's an important conversation. You're not going to want to miss it. Until then, though, remember this. At the end of the day, we're all on this trip together, so let's make it a good one. See you next time on Gather and Go. Gather and Go is hosted and executive produced by me, Brian Jewell. Our publisher is Mac Lacey. Danya Simmons is our creative director. Ashley Ricks is our circulation manager and graphic designer. Our sales team is Kyle Anderson and Talisa Reck. To advertise on the podcast, call Talisa at 859-253-0455. Gather and Go is a production of the Group Travel Leader. For more information about our magazines, podcasts, and events, visit us online at grouptravelleader.com. This episode was brought to you by Coastal Mississippi. Plan your best trip to Coastal Mississippi. Suntime recreation and dinnertime reservations will have you losing track of time with beautiful waterways and scrumptious seafood. Visit coastalmississippi.com and go have some fun for fun's sake.